Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 894th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Rachel Feinstein and Andrew Woolbright. We're thrilled to welcome poet Rachel James here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. In richly detailed sculptures and multi-part installations, Rachel Feinstein investigates and challenges the concept of luxury as expressed in 18th and 19th century Europe in the context of contemporary parallels. By synthesizing visual and societal opposites such as romance and pornography, elegance and kitsch, and the marvelous and the banal, she explores issues of taste and desire. Feinstein's work was included in the first iteration of MoMA PS1's Greater New York in 2000, and her first career survey, Maiden, Mother, Crone, at the Jewish Museum, New York, presented 3 decades of her work. And our host today, artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright, is based in Brooklyn and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is the founder and director of the Gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side in New York. In addition to curating, he's an editor-at-large of the Brooklyn Rail, and he teaches at Pratt and SVA. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew.
Hi, everyone. So great seeing you all. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and hope you're staying cool on this warm afternoon. I am so honored and privileged to get to talk to Rachel today about her shows that she has going on in Florence at the Stefano Bardini Museum, the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, and the Marino Marini Museum. But I also am excited to kind of get a larger overview of your practice, Rachel. So I thought we'd start there, and already so excited just getting to look into your studio and see all the work behind you. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to see friends in the audience. Hello. I see you. It's so nice to see you guys. And I'm doing good. I just got back from Maine, and my studio is looking a little bit cleaner than usual because we knew you guys were going to be here. I have 2 pieces. That one of them is the final version right behind me of Metal Storm that was shown in London, and the one in the back is the first version, the template, and we have them here because we're making them into bronze right now. So that's the first project on the agenda, is to basically map out all the pieces again, cut them all over again, and then make molds of them to then be cast in bronze. So that's why you see 2, and they're both a little bit different because they're all everything's handmade with the jigsaw, so nothing's an exact copy. So this will be the first time I'm making a bronze. So this is a new process for me. I'm excited. Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, with that, why don't we get right into the slides, because I also want to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them. Sure. But I wanted to include the first 4 or 5 slides, not to reduce you in any way. I want to keep this very dimensional, but looking at all of your work over the years, it seems like there have been some motifs or recurring forms that you take in your sculpture. And I thought maybe we could click through these first 5 slides and then kind of go back to the beginning.
That sounds great.
Because for me, each of these is like an idea that I think, at least from my perspective, you really carried forward as a whole body of work, but these individual pieces kind of lead you up to now. And before we get into kind of maybe finding language for these or defining them, you come from such a great lineage of artists. You were taught by Judy Pfaff, Ursula von Rydingsvard, also Kiki Smith. And here at the Rail, we love hearing about these genealogies and lineages and teaching. And I'm wondering what those educations were like, or if there's anything that you still kind of carry with you in your practice or learn from them.
Absolutely. I mean, I came from Miami in the 70s and the 80s when from a family that was a doctor and a nurse, and my sister's a veterinarian, and not really knowing that I wanted to be an artist as an actual profession, as a contemporary artist, in the sense that it wasn't an option. But I kept making things, and when I was a kid, I would make things with cardboard boxes and with shoes, and I would dip old sneakers in plaster. And the connection to my father being a doctor was very important, because he would bring home alginate, which is dental mold material, and plaster bandages, and these types of materials for me to kind of play with and practice with. And then when I got to college, I went to Columbia with Judy Pfaff as my teacher, and my parents did not want me to be an artist, and it was really not really an option at that time. So I was there for pre-med, and I almost failed out after the first semester. I was so bad at it. I'm happy that I never had to operate on somebody, because I would have killed them. And then I started to take these sculpture classes with Judy Pfaff on the side without my parents knowing. And I became so obsessed with it that I just said, this is what I'm doing. And she was this incredible kind of entry into understanding what contemporary art is for someone who really didn't have exposure to anything like that. So I realized you could make art with plaster bandages if you wanted to, and it was still considered art. And I thought that I was doing strange hobby work. So her work and her expression of just freedom and just making whatever you want was this explosion for me to be let loose into any material. I think the first assignment we had, it was make art out of garbage, and she took a garbage can out of the hallway and dumped it all into the floor, and we had to make a sculpture out of it. And it blew my mind that what I was doing was actually okay. And not only that, it could be even more of that. It could be more wild and aggressive, and any material you wanted. And an artist made work out of tar. And we were all people that I think in this class just got a whole bunch out of that experience. And then Ursula, I met through Judy, and her organic materials and use of cedar left a huge impression on me, which I still love wood, and I love to work with wood tools. And then Kiki was at Skowhegan, and my feeling of Kiki is that she always was a maker, and she always is a maker. And I remember meeting her the first time, and we were all sitting in a circle, and she was just making something like with clay or with string. I can't remember, but it was something that she was just working in between her fingers while we're all talking. And that left a huge impression on me. So these three women have been very, very important. And I don't know if I would be an artist, if in terms of making it my career, if it wasn't for them showing me the way and the road.
I mean, we're going to touch on folklore and fairy
Yeah.
tale and all of that, but I can't think of three sculptors for you to work with that just seem like they represent such important ideologies within sculpture. Like
Absolutely.
all of them are searching, but the difference between like Judy Pfaff searching through anything can be a part, like what to include, and Ursula in this like incredibly patient, slow process of searching through cedar over the years. Like, what an amazing spectrum to be
It's
in between.
incredible. And Judy
Yeah.
Pfaff, paved the way for Sarah Z. There's just Judy's whole expression of just like explosion art. And it was very unusual to have seen something like that, and still is. And then Kiki and Ursula's work are more about the object without there's not this dispensation of form. It's about the form. So they're all really, and it's very material based. All three of them, it's a concentration on finding what material to make that particular work and how they all work. So that's the heart of being a sculptor. You can switch between resin or clay or wood or metal, just completely based on what it is in the form that you're trying to show. Is it skin or is it hair? And that's the kind of beauty of the three of them, is that even though they're formally quite different, they all use color and material in a way to show their form. That's their identifying thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just really excited to now click through these first 5 slides, because you really go through the whole range of that in a way that I just love seeing. Can we go back to the first 2 slides of Ultimate Woman? It's a very, very exciting first work, and also motifs that you carry, I feel like, throughout your work. Like I was looking at like these wounds or orifices or erotic zones or tubes that come through a cast of your body. Like you're still kind of using that even as late as Bleeding Shepherdess, this like the body that has you know, its own, it's like aware of itself as an entry point and an exit, and the abjection, but also the erotics of that. But can you talk about this piece? And
so that's the plaster bandages that I was using when I was 10 years old, and I continued to use through college. And I had been a fashion model in Miami in the 80s, and then it was actually my foray into realizing there's a life outside of Miami, because I met a lot of very creative people in the fashion world on these trips and jobs to Europe. I lived in Paris for one summer, in Milan another summer, London another summer. And that's when I started to see art, and I started to go to museums and having that experience. And I knew that there was that world, but it still seemed quite foreign and distant to me. But the objectification of young girls, which I was at the time, and also at those times there was nobody kind of looking out for us. So there was a lot of predators. It was really an intense experience of just being thrown into this, and I'm grateful for it. But you have to kind of learn overnight, and this is a lot to do with those feelings of feeling very strange as being like a young girl, but all of a sudden I'm sexualized in these photos and these images that I was made to stand there and look very like erotic, but I was a virgin, and I'm in a foreign place. And on top of the medical side, and this strange thing is I think I made this work either right before seeing Kiki's work or right around the time I saw her show at Fawbush. And so a lot of this stuff even came before I even was aware of what she was doing and what the early 90s body identity work was happening. So I do believe that there's a whole thing of zeitgeist, that people all kind of do feel something because of just a cultural shift. So I wasn't the only one feeling that, obviously, and Kiki was doing incredible work and still does. But the one, I think I saw that tail sculpture with the woman with like the long shit coming out of her, and it just stopped me in my tracks. I could not believe how ballsy and amazing and formal it was too. So this was, a cast of my body that I made where I just put the plaster bandages all over my arms, and I couldn't get out because I had stupidly done it all without thinking, well, now how am I going to get out? So I asked a friend who's a really good artist too, Chloe Pina, who was in the class with me, to cut me out using a razor blade. And I still have the lines on my arms from the razor blade and my blood mixing with the lye inside the plaster. So it's also like an actual work that my blood was inside there myself. And I had this idea that it was slightly humorous with the fake fur around the orifices, but also obviously very sad. And it was chicken wire with like pillow like filling covering the chicken wire, and then I like colored it all with like a red like food coloring, and then I put beeswax all over the whole thing. So it's all very organic materials, and the piece doesn't exist anymore. It was too fragile, and when I tried to, I think, move it from one storage to another, it just fell apart and I threw it away. Yeah.
Can we jump to the next slide? Because I think some of that transition is here of like maybe one thing I really love about your work, and I think a lot of people do, is this kind of vexed relationship you have with being a model and an artist. And it's not moralizing or ethically critiquing either side. It's understanding both the inside and outside of it. And this piece, a rare abstract piece from you, feels like an aegis or kind of like a telltale heart of your practice, and maybe a step away from that abjection or the trauma that you experienced in 1993 and getting more towards this piece. But what was this like, or this standing cascade of mirrors?
I mean, my whole thing that's always been, I love formal, beautiful shapes, and Pino Pasquale has always been a big hero of mine. And I had seen a sculpture he did at Barbara Gladstone's gallery on Green Street in the 90s. It was called Cascade. It blew my mind. It was so perfect and so organic. And I always think about how it's extremely Baroque and very voluptuous, but also pared down, where there's no like frosting and foam on it. It's almost like the skeleton underneath a Rococo table, if you take everything off, all the golds and all the other stuff. And so it has a decadence to it that I love, having been raised in Miami, but at the same time, it's withholding. And withholding is always something that, as a woman and as a Jewish woman from Miami, I feel like I'm not capable of being ever. And I kind of pine away and wish I could be more like. So this is the only sculpture that I feel like I could do that. And I've never been able to do it since. And I actually bought this sculpture back from the collector because it means so much to me. And I want, so it's basically based on the jeweled net of Indra, which is this beautiful Buddhist idea that we're all diamonds on a net that reflect each other. So each of our souls have a reflection of Hitler, of our grandmother, of our future children's children. So we're all affected by each other. And so that's kind of why all the mirrors are reflecting each other, but it's also in itself all about duality. So all the positive shapes have holes, and all the holes are reflected within the mirrors, which themselves are both positive and negative. And I'm really into, I was a religion major at college. That's what I graduated with, because I wasn't allowed to be an artist. So somehow that would be the one I could graduate with, but not art, which is pretty funny. But yeah, this piece is a lot to me. I really, and the idea of also the objectification of being the woman and the model and the muse versus the maker, which is the other side. There are always these conflicts within me that I'm constantly battling internally myself. And that's, I think, your strength as an artist. Whatever those conflicts are, you make them into your art, and that's what that's about.
Yeah, I think just a shift from Ultimate Woman to this, like I love that this is somewhere between a figure commodity, but also that medical apparatus, and the shift from Ultimate Woman being like the plaster and the surgical bands, and this kind of becoming almost like the lights that are swinging over you as you're being operated on, and that formal beauty.
I love that idea, because it's like a perfume bottle, which I see now in the consumer kind of ideal. And also that models themselves, the really successful ones, actually have no personality whatsoever. You don't know what she's thinking. She herself is a blank canvas or a mirror reflecting back your own wants and desires. So that's why models a lot of times don't make great actors, because they're devoid of emotion, actually, in a lot of ways. They're almost like a vessel themselves. And that a good muse is the same thing. She gets dumped on whatever the painter or the director wants to see in her. So it's like there's this incredible like push and pull that's why I always think Warhol was so successful. I mean, he's a great artist, but he as an artist actually doesn't show what he thinks or cares about. It's a blank mirror as well. His work, you're like, well, what does he think about this Marilyn Monroe or Elvis? You don't know. It's just like another advertisement where it's just a bit of an unknown, you know?
Mhm. I really love the way you characterize that, because it makes me think of, there's that Virginia Woolf essay where she talks about hosting, like the act of hosting, that the host becomes absent or removes themselves.
Yes.
And basically being a model or a muse is like you're hosting the gaze or you're hosting the eye upon you. So
Exactly.
you have to kind of evacuate your own experience of the world to be that.
Which actually also in a lot of ways, in my opinion, I find it much easier emotionally to be void and to be a vessel. Like if I go to a party, for example, if I'm sitting there at the party, it's easier to be the person just sitting there letting someone talk to you than to have to, you're opening yourself up to show who you are, to expose yourself. So
Mhm.
my problem with a lot of contemporary art in general versus like a Rembrandt, for example, is you don't know what the artist is saying, and it's protecting the artist, and it makes it easier to sell and easier because you have a wider audience because no one knows what you're trying to say. It's like Peter Sellers' movie Being There. Everyone thinks, oh, you're a genius because you did this, but you never actually say that you did this. And you're exposing yourself so much more if you make something that is, first of all, figurative art is like letting yourself look like a loser to the world, just by basically. And it's just, it's so that's again my conflict is the idea of the vessel versus the maker, I guess,
Mhm.
or the muse versus the maker. Yeah.
Amazing. I also think this piece is pretty important, just so we can kind of, deal with the taxonomy of the type of aesthetics you've been doing. Where this is a really wonderful shift between these silhouette pieces that you start to do later that have like this XYZ axis. But this also has this beautifully modeled, Rococo drapery or curve that kind of gets reduced down to almost like an animation cell. Like it feels kind of like a Disney way of like doing it. And I know this piece came out of your interest or this building interest in tragedy too. But can you talk about where this piece came from and you revisiting it and how you're thinking about the flat silhouette versus the drape?
Well, I think like, well, this piece came about because of September 11th and being downtown when the tragedy happened and witnessing it all like with my own eyes and seeing people jump and this the horror of the whole thing and I was asked to do a piece for a show at Friedrich Petzel Gallery called Penetration that my friend Mark Fletcher curated, and this Grunwald image of Christ, with the nails in his hands it was so visceral. That was the first thing that came to mind when I thought of penetration. Was that it was very weird, and I'd never made a religious image in my life. And my father was Jewish, my mother Catholic, and I was raised in both religions. I was baptized, and then I went to get a bat mitzvah. I was always a kind of, it wasn't about the religious side at all. It was about the image of suffering and how that image really came to my mind. And the weird thing is then that, so the Grunwald painting in particular is, it's the Eisenheim altar, and it's and he has these green hussy swords. It's really viscerally intense. It's like you can't, I've never gone to see it in person and I really want to, but my father was a dermatologist, so he would bring home all these skin magazines and images of people with like green pussy swords. So it ties into all this stuff that then also ties into the fact that they were suffering from something called ergot. I only just recently found this out in the last 6 months, which was a fungus that made people go crazy and then die from this fungus that was on wheat in this particular period of time. And that's what they think the Salem witch trials were about. They think that that people actually lost their minds, and it became, the ergot became synthesized and made into LSD. in the 60s or the 50s. So, I mean, actually earlier in the late 1800s, they figured out. So this whole connection between witches, which is another fascination of mine, and green pustule shit from my dad to religion just connects in these really weird, subtle ways, and also very openly strong ways. And this image all started because of September 11th and the word penetration, which is so weird. So if you look at the painting, you'll see all of the forms come from that. And it was also mixing Pino Pascale's way of using structures like a model airplane form, and then pulling fabric or canvas and gessoing it on top. So that's how the whole thing was made.
Yeah, and that, now that you bring him up, also his piece, The Sea, or his installation, The Sea, of those kind of soft forms that are wonderfully over articulated in this way. I also kind of see you're so great at forming these, or it's so exciting to see the way you form these historical kind of dialectics with like the history of sculpture. Like I also see de Kooning sculpture in this a little bit. And
I love de Kooning sculpture, absolutely, completely.
Yeah.
I mean, the clam digger is like one of my favorite. I got to see one of those in person somewhere. I think it might have been at his studio. I could not believe. I was just like, this is incredible. Yeah. Good compliment.
Yeah, and then this is what I think of is like you're more kind of three-dimensionally realizing a drawing. They're like paper puppets that have been carved in wood. This is what is going to be taken into the foundries. Not this piece, but this type of work is what it also lends itself well to being public sculpture. And I'm wondering when this shift happened for you away from, this doesn't feel as much about, human tragedy, and instead feels more about this shift to the fairy tale or folklore. But when did that start happening in the studio for you?
Yeah, I'm amazed that you picked this one, because this one was the first one. I mean, I'm going to grab one of my paper sculptures. Hold on, I'll show you. Hold on.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, and if any of you have questions, I'm sure you have to, please go ahead and put them in the chat, because I don't want to hog all the attention here.
Okay, so this is the paper sculpture for the one that's right behind me right here. So this is how this one began. I'm a big drawer, and I think drawing is the way I figure out everything. I think a lot of people kind of think that sculptors are not drawers, but that's how all the form for me is realized. Is I'll see something that I like. This is from a Hans Loy like stone bas-relief from like 15 something that I loved, and it was of Adam and Eve, and she was reaching up through the tree taking the fruit to give to Adam. And I did I did a very pretty exact drawing of the original, and then it looked too much like the source and it didn't look like anything interesting. So then I started cutting up my own drawing, and I turned it into this little paper 3D model using a hot glue stick and and an X-Acto blade. And so that's kind of how I do everything now, and that's how I'm working on other public works. And interestingly, the way I figured out how to make them fabricated with other people and not just doing it myself in my own studio. So I would take the drawing, I'd scan the drawing before I started cutting it up. So I had the original. Then when I started cutting up the pieces, I would start putting them together. But I made this huge Marc Jacobs runway set in like 2012, I think it was. And I used paper models that I made for that. And the fabricator, Stefan Beckman, said, instead of just going straight into making the paper model, let's scan all those little flat pieces on a scanning bed. So we have that to go from for all the laser cutters. So that's now how I've been making aluminum sculptures that I did for Madison Square Park. And I'm making these bronze works, not this one in particular, because these are all going to be molded from the wood, but things that are more just like clear cut. So it's been an interesting experience. Yeah.
And And lastly, I feel like this is maybe the most relevant to when we start getting into your current show. This feels like the latest version of works that kind of come from working with Sculpey, like, and again, but keeping the theme of like taking the paper or like the desktop maquette and imagining it as a more monumental art historical scale. But when did this shift start happening? I know it started over or before COVID, but it's something you really embraced during COVID too.
Yeah, I think that again, the idea of the duality and always the push and pull within me, just about everything. It's the same thing with just form and color or paper, flat things versus round things. So when I was a kid, I would work with Sculpey a lot, and it always goes back to everything, I think, from childhood. And then when I had kids, I started to buy them these little packets of Sculpey, and they got really into it, and they would just play and make these incredible little sculptures all the time. And there'd be these leftover giant bags of like tiny pieces of all different colors of Sculpey that got all mixed together. And I thought, God, that looks really amazing, the way all this old clay looks in these little bits of color. So I took some of their old stuff and I made this sculpture for the Lever House show called Flower Girl. And I made it on Sculpey, and it came out so great. And the kids started adding things to it, and I kept trying to make it life size out of Sculpey, but of course the pieces kept breaking off and falling off. So it took me a couple years to really figure out how to make it look like Sculpey, but it's not Sculpey. So it's different types of resins that we use, pigments, in hand color ourselves in the studio. And some of them are water-based resins that are called Magic Sculpt. And some of them are something called Freeform Air. And some of them are polyester resins. So they all have different consistencies and opaqueness. And it's not like painting. So you have a de Kooning, Violent Women, who has one part that's a solid pink, but then there's a scumble of a dirty white on top of that. You could do that with this way of making these resins in different capacities. Yeah.
That's incredible. I wonder the way looking at these kind of like 4 or 5 periods of your work, these feel really like more empowering, or more, the figures have more agency. It feels like they're self-engineering themselves out of the Sculpey excess, like you said.
Yes.
Going back to Ultimate Woman, where it feels like really just like a traumatized figure of the gaze upon. But I wonder if that, I mean, how does that?
That's a really important, thank you for saying that, because I actually felt sad that I gave up more of the female form for a long time. And I did it, but then it wasn't in the same kind of manner with this kind of, I don't know, voluptuous female. And then when I was asked to do a show in LA, the first thing that came to mind were these Victoria's Secret runway shows, and how just the mixture of how you kind of thought how ludicrous this is and how terrible it is for women, but at the same time, they're really visually powerful and astounding to watch. You're just like, this is kind of amazing. So that's where all those women come from. They come from real models. And I also made them when I was an older woman, having been through a lot more and having had kids. And it just, and someone though did say to me, a friend of mine who's a great collector, and I love his eye, and he owns my work. He said, "Why did you make them look so beat up?" And I said, "I really don't see them that way. I think that I see them from the perspective of having seen like 3 births, like crazy shit done to my body over the years, like all this kind of stuff that happens as you get older. And I see it as a joyous expression of how a woman sees her own body versus being on a pedestal, like as that muse. I think this is now me making myself. And so we had this interesting conversation, that way.
Yeah. Well, I really feel like they kind of externalize the shame of culture in an interesting way, whereas like maybe the first few ideas magnetize it, like you feel the trauma, they don't feel traumatic. They feel, again, like self-engineered or like working through an aesthetic in a way that's really exciting. And can we go back?
The one thing that's crazy is I started making these works like 2014, I think, the girls. It took me a while to make I didn't know it was going to be LA. I was starting to just work on, and then the Weinstein thing happened, and then the Epstein thing happened. So it was so weird how these things, like the anger side of how women are portrayed, was just building up in me again. But it was a zeitgeist again, that it was, I think, it was just had to be popped, the cork had to be popped open, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. Can we go back to the beginning of these slides? I mean, we include those 3 images from your show at the Jewish Museum,
Yeah.
that are that beginning foray into fantasy and fairy tale, and has that wonderful like Disney kind of ladder where like the prince is usually and the princess usually go up and finish the movie together. You're playing on that. But then you're going into, after this slide, I believe we're into the current show and the current work. Just wanted to frame that for everyone so we know what we're looking at. But one thing that runs another current within all of your work is this brilliant identification of like the velocity of storytelling, or how to kind of engineer an image that gets traveled through. Like in narrative, it's the fairy tale and the folklore. In images or sculpture, it's Donatello, and it's like these hyper visualized way that like points in history where an aesthetic happened and it just got proliferated. And I think Victoria's Secret is like a really wonderful dialectic that you're creating too, of no, this is changing the way people feel in their bodies and the expectations of bodies as well.
Yeah, I could totally see the idea of symbols is always very important to fairy tales and to religion. And I'm always been very fascinated with the idea of, like, you know, the Bruno Bettelheim, the uses of enchantment, who turned out to be, I guess, a total creep himself. There's been a lot of interesting stuff about him, that, you know, Little Red Riding Hood, and the idea of the cloak, the red cloak is like the clitoral hood, and that the man is the wolf, all that kind of stuff. It's like red meat for me. I love going into, and how there's the connection is also that across centuries, across cultures, across man, woman, tribal, anything, they're all the same symbols. That's what's incredible, is that there's like 2 cultures in the history of the world where the sun is a woman and the moon is a man. There's things that literally are the way they are for some weird, deep, like visceral, inside everybody's body kind of reason. And that's what I'm really interested in, is tapping into that. That's a Veronese behind my little Victoria's Secret. So we made a bunch of little porcelain miniature. So I make my big Victoria's Secret girls from little sculpey women that I make with like a little wire armature, and I bake them in a little toaster oven I bought here. And everyone's not everyone, but a lot of people said, oh, can we buy those? And I said no, because they're just archivally a nightmare. Sculpey just falls apart after a couple of years. And so when I started working with Nymphenburg on these larger pedestal works that we'll see in a second, these I said, can we make these in porcelain? And so these no one's really seen these yet. There are 8 of them, and they're coming out soon. We're trying to figure out where to show them. And so there's Tintoretto, there's Veronese. This was the insane trippiness of this show for me, is that coming from no art history and then being obsessed with it and overwhelmed and in love with it, and then now seeing my work as this Miami Jewish Catholic girl from like the 70s and the 80s next to this, it's absolutely mind-blowing for me. And I was terrified that it wouldn't hold up, but it's an incredibly wonderful dialogue, because the things that I love, you could tell these great artists were thinking about themselves and their time. And to be a woman, to be able to be in that arena, it just really Wonderful. There's Donatello. There's 3 Donatellos on the wall next to that mirror sculpture. It's truly incredible. Yeah.
How are you thinking about color for your figural sculpture? Because in the paintings, I love that you're using that Bardini blue to create this like wonderful illusion of like the painting going through the wall almost.
Yes.
But in the figurative sculpture, how are you thinking about one like this with the sculpey?
So the blue on the walls in the Bardini they're called Bardini blue. He came up with that himself, and they're different blue rooms, and color's always been a very very important thing. This is the Icicles, who I think is kind of based on more of a Picasso blue period type of palette. I think color is a way to actually show form. So I started to make these sculpey girls. At first, I think I might have made one in all white sculpey, and then I realized I really, really wanted to show the different elements of their muscles or of their bras or of their face, using these different little pockets of messed up color that my kids had in their sculpey bag, and that really opened up everything. Because you look at the de Kooning Violent Women paintings and how he uses the ballerina pink to contrast with a scarlet red, and how these 2 colors next to each other do something. And you also can use that pink to form a shape of the cheek, but then the red will do something else in terms of the shadow of the cheek. And the cheek and the color become one, and they don't signify that they're basically not haphazard, even though it looks like it is. I guess that's the point, Yeah.
Oh, I love that, like that you're thinking of it in that way, of like these intensities and points of focus. It makes me think too, going back to Grunwald, that like there's that foot of Christ that I think about all the time. It doesn't feel like it belongs in any painting, let alone the painting of the foot of Christ. And I was trying to recall it. There's a French critic that I only know because of Agamben writes about it, but there's a French critic who talks about how the detail within painting and sculpture, we've always misidentified, misinterpreted the detail. The detail is supposed to knock us out of the illusion of painting and sculpture, that like as soon as it starts to become immersive, that like super point of color or that super point of like hyperfixation that Vermeer could do removes that immersion, which I think is great.
That is amazing. And it's like the idea, again, this is another thing I think about a lot, is being in your body versus being outside of your body, and how religion and spiritualism has always been about women not being really allowed to be at the highest levels of Christianity, for example, because they're not allowed to be outside of their body. They're stuck inside because of menstruation and pregnancy, and not being able to control what happens within their body. And I think sculpture is a very interesting thing for me, because it's inside my body. Sculpture is like, when you look at a sculpture, you feel your own presence in front of the sculpture. But for me, painting is like being outside of my body. I'm not in my own field or world. I become like a little floating soul in that space of the painting, and it's just this wonderful kind of reverberation between the 2 bodily planes or spiritual planes, all the time.
Amazing. Can we talk about this one since we're on it, this like removal of the figure to just be like the filigree or the wave with the shoes? I mean, the absence that this creates is so beautiful.
So this one's called Doctore. There's 6 of them I've made so far, and they all started a long time ago. Again, it was a collaboration for fashion. I was asked by my friend Katie Grand, who's a very well-known fashion stylist, and runs a lot of magazines, to be a art director on a fashion story for Garage magazine. And I had this idea of using these little pedestals that are made in Nymphenburg by this famous sculptor named Franz Anton Bustelli, who was the early 1720. He made these Commedia dell'arte figurines, you know, Scaramouche, Dottore, Horine, all these kind of standard figures on these incredible Rococo wave bases that were made simply to hold the figure up in the kiln and make it as a pedestal. And I started to look at these as these Pino Pasquale, incredible arte povera, very abstracted, beautiful, violent Baroque forms that look like these pared down kind of skeletons, like I was talking about earlier. So I started to construct them myself in my own studio at my height, with then putting the shoes on for the missing figures. Of this one was Dottore, and those are his shoes, but at my scale. So those are my size shoes, but the whole thing's made out of ceramic. So when you make something in ceramic, it has to be about 20%, 10 to 20% larger, because it gets shrunk when it's fired. So making them in my size in clay, they're like huge. They look like giant, like, you know, like Shaquille O'Neal shoes, and then they shrink down, and then they look like this. And so the shoes are also removable. And the reason why I did it that way is because when the shoes are not there, then the fairy tale slash kind of sadness of the missing person totally goes away, and then they become more like purely abstract sculptures. So they function in both ways.
Yeah, I love the pedestal on its own. And also going back to Commedia dell'arte, I was wondering, when I first saw these, I thought it had a relationship to Zani or Harlequins, or this like trickster muse that has existed within that. Is that something you've been thinking about as well?
Well, what I was kind of curious about was, like, you know, the Commedia dell'arte itself. I started to read some of the stories, and Punchinello the Fool, and how so-and-so would have an affair with so-and-so's wife. And it seemed really old-fashioned and really boring. But then I realized it's exactly what, like, it's the same kind of thing that every culture wants. There's, you know, like, who's Kanye with now? It's like, it's this need to know and to gossip, and that there's these standard figures. There's the, you know, faithful wife, there's the cheating husband, and that what I was interested in more is the symbolism of how it ties to our times and what we all still want to know about and think about as being human. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that kind of leads into another question I had about your work, which is I get a feeling that you really love history for a lot of reasons. You're attracted to it through tragedy and the experience of tragedy, but also this union idea of archetypes, of seeing archetypes like the Maiden and the Crone, and then these revisions. And I wonder how you are thinking about them as you're making your paintings and sculpture. Are you handling it with comedy or pathos, or how are you interested in the oven mitts of handling history?
I think that I've always been kind of intimidated by it, thinking, like, someone who was in Europe, I think Florentine asked me, like, what was it like for you to be in this show? Is it really scary? And I said, well, I was worried that I was going to get there and my stuff wouldn't hold up. You don't really know. But then at the same time, I said, I've been very lucky to have had no history and no culture, because I'm not aware on a level all the time of, like, oh yeah, Leonardo and Michelangelo just lived right there, you know. And I think that I was very freed to have had such a blank tablet of a childhood that was very nature based. It was about the wilds and craziness of this jungle that I lived around. And so you know, like alligators and parrots. My mother had a menagerie of wild parrots that she basically took care of every day. And it was a surrealistic experience, and it was incredibly visual and freeing. The way, that's why I think all artists really do make all the work that they figured out when they were little kids. Like, as a child, your brain is just open to anything, and you don't know what the difference is if something's real or if it's fake. and or if God really exists, or if he doesn't exist, or if there's a boogeyman that's hiding in your closet and he's going to come out and kill you at night. Like that kind of stuff is what I think really becomes very powerful as an older artist, is to tap into that. Going into Florence and seeing the way that these incredible cultural icons were able to do that using religion or using the Medicis, or it's just a way into it. And art history for me, it has been intimidating. But then when I look at it from a very naive standpoint, I can jump right in, if that makes sense.
Completely. I think Roberto Bolaño had this line talking about reaching into history with a dirty hand, like starting from a place of corruption or unknowing, and then seeing what happens when you stir the water. And also, I think too of that what you're describing too. That's a developmental stage in childhood, like the animistic stage where anything that moves has life.
Exactly. And you also think, the hard thing is when you look back, like there's a Michelangelo bas-relief right in this Palazzo garden, and the curator showed it to me, and he did this little bas-relief. I could send pictures to anyone who wants to see it afterwards. It's in one of these little side rooms of this outside room. And he said that it's not 100% certain that it was Michelangelo, but he was there at the time, and it was made when he was possibly 14, 15, or 16 years old. And it's astounding. And it's incredibly intimidating as a sculptor to see something like that. And the way I look at it, to not feel that way, is to think, well, first of all, he's dead. I'm thinking alive right now. He was alive at some point with the same problems and hopes and dreams. He shat, he pissed, he got depressed. He couldn't work many days of the year because he was sad. Like you have to just realize, like, every person has that same group of problems, and art history sometimes puts, these greats on a pedestal, but being alive and getting able to see that distance is like kind of more shrunk, that I'm like side by side next to this guy. Is just like, who knows if people are going to be looking at my stuff 500 years from now, or 1,000 years, but I really hope so. And I hope that basically having this dialogue with the past will just make it even stronger, my work stronger. Yeah.
Totally. And it makes me think too of we haven't had a chance to talk about it, but Donatello kind of lingers as a figure within this work, but Donatello and his frenemy rivalry with Brunelleschi of Brunelleschi is the Greek antiquity and sculpture, the authority and power, and then Donatello comes along and it's the mismeasured faces, the gauntness and the strangeness, the subjectivity coming through. But maybe can we? The Penitent Magdalene is part of this experience. How are you transforming and adopting it for this show?
So basically, I didn't even talk about this, but the reason why those Victoria's Secret girls really came into being at the scales that they are is totally because of Donatello. So I had been to Florence about 6 years ago because my husband John Curran had a show there, and I got to see, and I had been in Florence years before that for my honeymoon, so I've been in Florence various times, luckily, but for some reason the last time, about 6 years ago, I just had this experience with looking at the Penitent Magdalene, standing next to her at the Museo dell'Opera, and seeing for the first time, she's actually larger than life. She's a very strange size. She's just a wee bit too big. And then I went to the Bargello and I saw the Donatello David, who's just a wee bit too small. And I just realized he did this on purpose. And why did he do this on purpose? Why is the Donatello David he's not a child, he's not a little boy, like who's like a 6-year-old boy, he's a slightly smaller teenager. And then the penitent is slightly larger, older woman. And I got this idea that he did it because when the larger scale, first of all, the Magdalene is in wood and it's like a desiccated, the material thing is again back and very important. The desiccated wood with the larger than life size body of this woman becomes frightening. She looks like a dry monster. And then the boy, teenage boy, a young man, becomes like a wet little sex doll. Like there's this complete opposite, incredible fusion to how you feel it in your own body standing there. So I made 4 of those Victoria's Secret girls the exact size of the Donatello David, and then 4 of them the exact size of the Donatello Magdalene for that reason. And they do that. The little ones make you feel like you just want to kind of pick them up and move them around and do what you want with them. And then the big ones, you're like, I don't know, you kind of freak me out. You know, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I like thinking too. I've been thinking about like trying to find words for it, but that Magdalene, that the burl of the wood, like you described, and you shifting the burl to this kind of clump or this like over rounded curvature thing is like really interesting.
Yeah, that Magdalene, that wood Magdalene was from a drawing from the Vatican, and I made it into one of those paper models. And so the the Carlo Molino curved chairs and sculptures that he did out of plywood, I was trying to mimic that by using layers of thin 1/8 inch plywood soaked in like a model form and then vacuuming it to get those curves. And I loved that burl of the eye that just came out by accident. And then the hair was supposed to all be clamped, like kind of clamped together. But I loved how it looked just before we clamped it. So I let it all be open like that. Yeah. You have to let little kind of surprises stay, you know what I mean? And not kind of try to control them. Yeah.
Totally. Well, it's interesting going back to the collector you mentioned that talked about the ugliness of it, because I see that curvature and that clumping, and I think a lot of sculptors do very differently. It's more of that de Kooning, like golemness, or that Kippenberger. It's this like revolution, like this reactive bathos, this kind of punk sensibility of pushing back on the eye of the viewer in this like
that's kind of what I have to say. I'm in terms of like what I'm thinking about now, I want to get more back into that idea of allowing more spontaneity. I think as you get older as an artist, you become more brittle and more afraid of making mistakes. It's like I fell down and I fell down. I was skiing with my kids and I broke my leg very, very badly a couple months ago. And it makes me now walk like I'm terrified of every step. And I have, and that kind of thing as an artist getting older and being worried about walking or about falling or about making mistakes in your own work is a terrible, terrible thing. And how do you allow yourself to fall and to fuck up and to make huge mistakes when more seems to be riding on, if you do fuck up, it's bad. You know what I mean? It's like you have a longer period of time to walk again. And so I'm trying to use this accident as a metaphor to really like, you know, like look at like Isa Genskin and Franz West and Kippenberger and these guys. It's just like, it's so interesting how it's like, I love the Germans and like, you know, the Nymphenburg and there's something about Max Beckmann. I have a particular kind of violence in my own making and my form, and I want to keep pushing that farther and farther right now. I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
And it connects to the Strasbourg origin site of witches that you're interested in, that I would love to talk to you about, but you've already done so well with Yvonne. Okay. I have so many more questions that we didn't even get to, but this is wonderful. Something that I did want to bring up, and I just to hear your thoughts on it, and I think you'll disagree with it, but in an interesting way. Theodor Rollstadt talks about figurative painting right now as an act of disfiguration, or this this kind of larger sensibility of interest in grotesque, interest in like caricature, interest in humor coming through, and that's in painting. I think your work is more vexed and more complicated and holds more tensions than that. But I wonder how you think of these sculptures in terms of like a disfiguration.
I mean, I think that just making them, I have to then really be in my own body. Just that was what was really hard about having a broken leg for so long. I mean, you have to stand, and not only that, like I learned from my PT woman, you have to also like actually learn how to put all your strength deep into your core, like almost like if I was doing martial arts. Like she said that she works on martial art kind of guys, and that when they're throwing a punch, they're still moving their core into their punch into the other assailants, and that's where then their core becomes, as they transfer their weight. And she said that's the same thing with what I do in my work. It is so physical, and it's so much about being able to push and physically move material that that the disfiguring in a weird way almost comes about because of just disfiguring my own body in a weird it's very aggressive, and it hurts my hands. I have lots of polyester resin like kind of still permanently stuck in parts of my body. I have these little weird scars from the plaster bandages. I mean, so I see this as a kind of a true labor of love, in the same way birthing my children are. You make something that has never existed in the world, and you leave a big part of your own physical self with that work, you know? So, and that's where I think it's very different than painting, because when I've done my mirror paintings, I don't have that. Like I'm just like aggression, and I need to like get ready and roll up my sleeves and put my hands deep into that stuff, you know, that is making. Yeah,
I like that disfiguration through force, or the force of your body getting transferred into it. I have two last questions because I also want to give time to everyone. Are there any, beyond Pinot and Pascali, are there any exhibitions that have been formative to your practice? And my other one is I'd love to know what your dreams are like. Do your dreams have a relationship to the type of work you make, being a Jungian and all these archetypes?
those are good questions. I would say the first thing that I ever saw that definitely was like the opening of like, wow, you don't have to just like make work that looks like Rodin if you're a sculptor. I saw Dwayne Hanson's work at the University of Miami Art Gallery in the 80s, I believe. And he had like a tourist sculpture there, and I think like a workman of some kind. And it just, I was like, this is art. It was incredible. It really, really blew my mind. And then I saw a Sylvie Fleury like bag installation at FIT University at some group show, I think in about 88 or 89, which also really blew my mind. And then in terms of like big stuff, seeing the Picasso sculpture show at MoMA was incredible. Incredible. The wood plywood kind of bull sculpture is one of the most incredible. That just did it all for me. And then Dasso Dossi is a painter, and I happened to see his work, you know, his famous old master, but they're so weird. The faces on Dasso Dossi's paintings, they are so strange that I was like, you could be an old master and make faces that look like this. And it really, and then there was a show in Cologne many years ago called Reimagine Venus. And it was showing different artists' renditions of Venus. And there was the Cezanne one of like this little like Venus that's like this big with all these people blowing trumpets around her. And then there was a Rosso Fiorentino painting that was just insane. So the combo of all people imagining the ideal woman as a show was an incredible construct in my mind. So those are the ones I would say. And then dreams. So
Amazing.
I have a dream therapist that I meet with once a week, and we just go. I record my dreams. I tried to do it by writing it down, but I couldn't even read my writing, and so now I record them on my phone and I dictate them, and then they get like kind of written out through a dictation thing. And even then, the garbling sometimes so crazy that I can't really make anything out of it. But it's become very important, and the reason why is she said this once to me, and it's actually become totally true. She said, once you start being really aware of your unconscious through your dreams, you don't lose those 8 hours of sleep. They become part of their full cycle of your day. So I am literally working in my sleep. There are millions of cases of scientists who've woken up and they know the solution to their equation because they've been working it through their dreams. And so I think dreams are incredibly important. And it's the place where you can be free and you can be outside of your body, and I'm not a woman from 1971 in Miami. I can be anything, and they all are me. They're all different facets of me. So, the house that I've had a dream about is me. The dog is me, and it's not really me. It's this unknown me that has lived for hopefully long periods of time from all different places, and that's where the connection is.
Yeah, and like you said, Jung said that the shadow loves being discovered. That moment where you realize the dream is the architecture of you. You get that time back. I love that. Well, I don't want to take more of your time because I want everyone to have a chance to get to ask you questions. But thank you so much, Rachel. This is wonderful, and I've got another 4 hours of questions that I will save for another time. But thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Gosh, that was so wonderful. Thank you both so much for that conversation. I could listen to it for a few more hours. So we have if you have a question from the audience, please post it in the chat or raise your hand and I'll give you the mic. In the meantime, Rachel, I'm going to ask you a question of my own.
Sure.
I was curious about how you decided what works would go where in Florence. It just feels so very well thought out, and the juxtapositions are just really thoughtful and evocative. And I was curious to hear more about that process and these different
I had
spaces.
nothing to do with it at all. That's what's amazing, is that I sent them a huge giant assortment of all the works, pages and pages and pages where they were, and they chose the curators are Sergio Risalti and Stefano Rispoli, and they choose like a whole another group of stuff, and then some of the collectors wouldn't allow it, or said maybe it was too far or this that. Then it got down to this other group of work, and then I of course had some ideas, and I said, oh, I think that we should have the porcelains here, and they're like, no. I was like, are you sure? I really think they need to be on this platform. They're like, no. And then I got there and I was completely wrong. And everything that I thought was gonna look right was actually an insanely terrible idea. So I realized that it's like architecture. I thought that I could design my own house, or I could buy the right couch for my room. I cannot. There are people that are much better than I am. And so I let the professionals do that. And Kelly Taxter did my whole show at the Jewish Museum. I've now since learned that artists actually need curators. And so I let it go. I don't do that anymore. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. I believe Andrew is in possession of Fong Bui's question, which will be the last question of the day before we conclude today's event with the poetry reading.
Absolutely, I am. So I'll do my best to get this to you. It's a wonderful question from Fong. What about the tradition of American Gothic fiction that explores dark themes of irrationality versus guilt and other forms of Puritanism and religious conservatism? Writers such as Flannery O'Connor, John Hawkes, J.D. Salinger, some of my favorites.
Oh man. So what about it?
Yeah, what about it? Yeah, does your work have a relationship to the Southern Gothic?
That's so interesting. I mean, Truman Capote, like I do like the Flannery O'Connor, you know, the Cormac McCarthy, like the road, like I scary kind of fairy tales definitely interest me. The South interests me. And I also J.D. Salinger, it's all about also the other side, you know, the story that he was supposedly not a great person. All these kind of things also really interest me. Like, where do they come from and why are they saying these things and how do they, you know, I love J.D. Salinger. I love all Flannery O'Connor. They're all really important, and I am interested in now I don't read anymore. It's very sad. Because I just can't. It seems like my brain with the news, all the technology. So I do everything as a book on tape. I have like the headphones, and I just do. And I've read Dune. I've done all, and it's pretty. I've gotten really into Ursula Le Guin recently, actually, and so I do love the Southern Gothic for sure. Yeah. The moss with the element of you know, a funereal side to it for sure. Yeah.
Thanks for asking that question on Fong's behalf, Andrew. And thank you again so much for this incredibly rich and generous conversation,
Thank
Rachel and
you.
Andrew. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Rachel James, to the stage. Rachel James is a poet and artist based in New York with a background in experimental ethnography. She's the author of an Eros encyclopedia, and her poems have been published by The Recluse and Form 4. She has presented her work in the United States, Canada, and Europe. As an audio documentarian, she has worked with BBC Radio, WNYC, The Organist, and others. And with that, I will pass it over to Rachel James.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. It was really, I've never done one of these before, and it's such a strange format. So it's cool to just hop on at the end. I'm not going to read for very long, but yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you for this amazing body of work. V says, it's like ghosts you can't see unless you throw a sheet over them. And we need that hidden thing as poets. Tonight, your memory found me much too sober. V suddenly goes into shadow and looks like a witness on unsolved mysteries. She laughs. What's fairy tale time? A menagerie of parrots after disgusting forgiveness quotes in a public bathroom. Idea. Revulsion planet orbits a purple sun whose rays cause blistering minute volcanoes of pus-like substance to wet the atmosphere so much that it lines the mouths of its inhabitants. Be like a loose tooth flipping on a tiny thread of gum. Marriage, private property, love under capitalism. In Antonioni's Red Desert, a child asks his mother, "What's 1 + 1?" She looks at him adoringly. "It's 2, silly, you know that." The child takes a dropper of blue liquid from his science kit and carefully squeezes the rubber top. A drip falls onto a square glass plate covered in gauze. "That's 1, he says, squeezing the rubber top again. "That's 2. And the 2 blue liquid drops expand into each other, becoming 1. He holds the glass up to his mother. T asks, "What is scary?" Opulence, one eye permanently held shut, not covered or gouged out, the other eye forced to look. In Michael Hart's Red Love, our bonds to each other are regarded in terms of ownership and property relations. For Alexandra Kollontai, the critique of love is inherently a property question. Only once property love is abolished can we begin to invent a new love, a revolutionary love, a red love. O benevolent mistress, make my bed, make my tea, mend my television, grind my time. To make do in this overdue, September dancing on me, burning September. A man stops on Waverly Street. It's the fires, he says, and keeps walking. I call to him, where? Burning September, like the sirens all day, I'm pressing out of the basement with Ian. We say, it feels like the past. Later, I hear see out the window. It feels like the future. The smoke drifts by. Elle and I don't know whether to close the windows or leave them open. I know I could disappear. I talk to myself, not with words. To make do in this overdue. Makes 3 columns. A, interesting, creepy, disturbing locations. B, fears, probably your own. C, fluids of any kind, yolk, vomit, vaginal discharge. USA, unending physical pain. Under the bridge, the ruins where a stranger stroked the palm of your hand every time your father looked away. The rodeo in Midtown. Suffering, Sprite, snakes falling from above, sexual abuse, sailing, rancid coconut water, pus, parent-in-law house, nighttime, neo-Nazism, nation states, my brother hurts himself, mucus, Mountain Dew, mist, losing our love, losing into people's eyes, Laura's dream, pushed off a cliff suspended in eternity, realizing you're not at the beginning because there isn't one. IV drip insertion, hotel bathroom, hairs on the old slide, giving birth to an infant who grows to be a child, then dies. Gasoline, free health clinic in Chelsea with religious doctor exams, experiencing the sensation of being seen by other humans, eternity, economic greed, drool, dried blood and plaster, doing harm to others without witnesses, cold dampness on a vigil site stone, chlorine, being a young model, being unable to make money, archetypes, a huge pickup truck tailing closely on a fast road. Even on a city block, you can walk into a cobweb. Even in this way, I'm curled into myself, a subtle thread. Even as I recall walking this block with you, I do not recall you. This open field I remember, another Rachel, not myself, a literal other Rachel with another life, with statue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was such an incredible conclusion to today's program. That was so beautiful. Thank you for reading. Thank you again, of course, to Andrew and to Rachel Feinstein as well for this conversation. And if you find yourself in Florence, Italy before September 18th, I hope you have a chance to see the 3 concurrent exhibitions that were talked about today. Thank you, of course, as well to Constance from Rachel's studio and Clementine from Gagosian, who were so supportive in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE and make daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For 22, almost 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation between Larry Pittman and Dan Cameron on the occasion of Pittman's solo exhibition, Sparkling Cities with Egg Monuments at Lehman Moffin in New York. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Oliver Tompkins Ray. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much. And I hope you all have great weekends.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rachel, for your reading.
Thank you, Rachel.